All right, shalom, shalom. First and foremost, I want to start this lesson by giving all praises, glory, and honor unto Yahweh, Bahashem, Yahweh Shai, Bahashem Rachakodash. Double honors to the elders and apostles of Great Millstone who taught us all this truth and who also rule and teach well. And shalom to all the Achim in this truth and sincerity, starting with the 144,000 and the one third of the nation of Israel, which we are fighting to be a part of. This is your brother Chabar Yakal coming back. Lord willing, with another quick and edifying lesson. And as you can see from the title, is Isaiah 4. There will be many Abigails. All right, and this was just something I was meditating on. I believe earlier today, it was either earlier today or yesterday, and basically I was just meditating on that account of Abigail, or that account of David when he encountered Nabal's wife Abigail. And for time's sake, I'm not gonna get the account, and that's the spirit. It's 11:44 called like how about Shemi how shot low and of that number. But I looked up on chat. I'm gonna show you what I looked up. Um, Basically I looked up an overview because like I mentioned, I'm not going into the whole account just for time's sake. But I basically said give a quick overview of the biblical account of David and his men when they encountered Nabal and Abigail and the significance. All right. And like I mentioned, I was just meditating on that, randomly throughout the day, when we're at work, in our day-to-day life, the scriptures should always be on our mind, even though, we slip up, we are in the flesh, you're not going to be 24/7 doing lessons, 24/7, you know, praying, you know, in the lotus position, like the apostles always say, just levitating, meditating. But we do meditate though. You might be at work and meditating while you're working. You might be driving to work, you might be driving to the grocery store, so on and so forth. But, we're thinking about the scriptures. We're not, basically what I'm saying is we basically live normal lives, but on the inside of our mind, we're thinking about the scriptures, we're sending up prayers. Every prayer doesn't have to be facing the east, on your knees, which are, prostrating. Every A lot of times when you pray, if somebody was to look at you while you're praying, they wouldn't even know you're praying. Basically, what I'm trying to put, Clark Kent. What I'm trying to say, we're in Clark Kent mode. I was in Clark Kent mode and I was just meditating, randomly, but it was through the spirit about this account. So I'm gonna read this. It says this account is in 1 Samuel 25. David and his men were living in the wilderness while fleeing from King Saul. During this time, they protected the shepherds and livestock belonging to a wealthy man named Nabal. It says, when sheep shearing season came, a time of celebration and generosity, and it's giving you the context, which when you read the actual account, having that in mind, it was a season where people were supposed to be generous. That account hits even harder. Because I'm not gonna lie, I kind of didn't know that. Either I didn't know it or I didn't notice it in that account, but I didn't know it was a time of, like I said, celebration of generosity. So that was even more of a slap on the face because it could have been any day and that would have been offensive, you know. But I'm gonna continue on, and you're gonna see why I said it was offensive if you don't know this account already. It says David sent men to Nabal respectfully asking for provisions. In other words, food and basically supplies, to keep going. Again, they were fleeing from Saul. You gotta imagine how much energy that took. You being chased down, which, Lord only were the men of the Lord. Hey, we're coming into times where we may be chased down by our enemies. Beginning with Esau, Edom, okay, the so-called white man. They're gonna just like they came after. I was just watching the elder from LA. he did a lesson. I believe the title was "They came for our apostles, they're going to come for us." You know, so if you're in this truth and you truly believe, which Lord willing, we endure unto the end, there's a good chance, there's going to come a day, we're going to be on the run. Either they're going to try to kick in your door, or the spirit might alert you before they even come to your house, and you might be on the run already. You might be at work, and and people just like the movie Matrix. He was at work, and there was some agents after him. It might be a situation like that. Who knows? And then you got to do some dramatic getaway. But the Lord's always going to make a way to escape, even if they so-called arrest you, because the scripture does say that, Revelation 2:10, that shall cast some of you into prison. But the Lord's always going to make a way to escape. But continuing on, it says, Nabal insulted David and refused to give them anything, essentially acting as though David were a nobody. It says, and this is a quote from 2 Samuel. It says, "Who is David?" Well, matter of fact, I gotta say it like how you gotta imagine how he would say it. Who was David, and who was the son of Jesse? You gotta imagine, because that was a nigga. And the ball's a nigga, man. All right, you see these YNs today. You see these so-called, these hood guys. These so-called gangsters. That was kind of the spirit and the ball was in, like just a nobody, a low life, and he was trying to downplay who David was. We're talking about the king of Israel. We're talking about a man who's famous for killing tens of thousands of Philistines. A man who Nabal knew who David was. He was really just sneak dissing. You got to put that into today's time. You got jakes like that today. Who sneak this the apostles, who like the scripture says, backbiters. They'll say shit behind your back. You know you'll encounter jakes like that. When I say jakes, I'm talking about Israelites, so-called blacks, Hispanics, and Native Americans, Israelite foreigners. You'll encounter jakes like that in the truth, that so-called call themselves in the truth. So they call themselves Israelites, and you're really gonna encounter that in the world too. Your own people coming against you. But this was an account in the scriptures, account in the scriptures, showing that the scripture says whatsoever thing was written aforetime was written for our learning. So accounts like this is for us to know basically what to do in a similar situation. All right, David became furious and set out with about 400 armed men intending to kill Nabal and the males of his household. So he was basically about to crash out. David was about to crash out, and really rightfully so. You know, that David and his men, they showed him respect. They took care of his livestock, and then that's how you're gonna repay me. Saying who was this guy trying to downplay you? Like I said, you're gonna encounter that, especially amongst, you might be at your job, wherever the case is, and like I said, even in the truth, you got Israelites that will like these other camps, just for an example, they'll sneak diss you, they'll say things under their breath, or they'll straight up talk shit. The point is, this was written for us to know. For so when it happens to you, well, you'll be like, well, it happened to David, it happened to Yahushua, it happened to Paul. You'll be able to look at the scriptures and say, this isn't some like it says in Peter, thinking not strange. So when something like this happens to you, you don't think it's strange because you're like, well, I know my forefathers, went through similar situations, similar straits. This is the straight gate after all. It says, but Nabal's wife Abigail heard what had happened. She quickly gathered a large amount of food, met David before he reached Nabal, bowed before him, apologized for her husband's foolishness, which, by the way, when you look up the word Nabal, it actually means I believe it actually means foolish. If I'm not mistaken. Something to that effect. He was basically a YN. or an old head, or whatever, because the ball might have been old. You don't know. I'm just trying to paint a picture in today's time. He was basically a nigga. All right, I'm gonna just speak plainly, but continuing on. Where was I at? It says they bowed before him, apologized for her husband's foolishness, and persuaded David not to shed blood out of personal vengeance. The Lord put the spirit on her to say that to him. David recognized that the Most High, Yahweh, Bashim Yahushai, had used Abigail to stop him. The Lord put a heavy spirit on Abigail, you know. She probably didn't even think to say that. It just the spirit was just on her to say it and to do what she did at that moment to intercept him and basically stop him from avenging himself. But it says, "Blessed be the Lord Yahweh Bashim Yahushai of Israel, which sent thee this day to meet me." 1 Samuel 25:32. After Abigail returned home later told Nabal what had nearly happened, Nabal's heart died within him. He had a heart attack, and he became as a stone. About 10 days later, the Lord smote Nabal. He basically was like he got put into a coma, if I'm not mistaken. I'm extrapolating what the scripture said. He had a heart attack, and he probably was went into a coma. He wasn't moving. He was probably just laying down and couldn't do anything. And then the Lord took him. All right. It says, what was that? The Lord smote Nabal that he died. 1 Samuel 25:37-38. David then recognized that the Most High dealt with Nabal rather than David taking vengeance himself. Afterward, David married Abigail. All right. The significance. It says the story mainly demonstrates restraint. The scripture speaks about he that have or no rule over his spirit is like a city without walls. Okay. There's another scripture that says, he that is slow to anger, he that is slow to anger is better than the mighty. Matter of fact, I'm gonna look it up real quick because that's an important lesson to us in the times we're in now. Because Satan is trying us on a high level, in various ways. We're agitated in the spirit. So it's like we're already agitated, and then Satan will do something to try to tip you over the edge when you're already at the edge. But speaking to myself first and foremost, we have to remain, with that restraint. All right, I believe it's slow to anger. Hold up, which there's many scriptures on this. Yeah, he that is Proverbs 16:32. He that is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he that ruleth his spirit than he that taketh the city. So the Lord taught David a lesson in that moment to rule his spirit. And he actually he took heed to what the Lord was trying to tell him, even though he told him through a woman. He could have been in the spirit of who oh, who's this lady, Oh, that's his wife, get her. He could have been in that spirit, but David had enough wisdom to see that the Lord really was speaking through that woman, which is spiritual because wisdom is likened unto a woman. So, where was I at? Demonstrates restraint, wisdom, and leaving vengeance to the Most High. That's for us in these times, not to avenge ourselves when somebody wrongs us. As hard as that is, it's easier said than done. A lot of times, in the flesh, you want to put hands on somebody, but that's not the right way to go. Unless you're being attacked, and that's a different story. If somebody's actually attacking you or trying to attack you, that's a whole different story. But I'm talking about somebody just, is just basically bothering you. I'm not necessarily saying attacking you. That might do something, messed up. They might say, uh, you know, say say something out the side of their mouth about you. All right, hell, you might. Your damn manager might wrongfully fire you from a job or something like that. You can't avenge yourself. Just leave it in the Lord's hand. And that's why the scripture says you must believe that He is. You got to believe that those are all that our power, our Father is the Almighty. He's an all-powerful, righteous power. He's not just gonna allow something wicked to happen to you and then it goes on unnoticed or unpunished. It might not happen immediately, but He's gonna get whoever messed with you. He's gonna get whoever did something to you. And we have to believe that. And that actually ties into what I was gonna go into next. Let me read a little bit more, but I'll get to that. Where am I at? Leaving vengeance to the Most High says David was about to commit bloodshed and anger, but Abigail's wisdom prevented him from doing something he could later regret. It says it also creates a strong contrast. Nabal represents foolishness, pride, and ingratitude, while Abigail represents wisdom, humility, courage, and discernment. In fact, Nabal means fool, which Abigail herself points out in verse 25. Most importantly, David learns that the Most High can defend him without David taking personal vengeance or personal revenge. And we have to believe he'll do the same for us. The scripture says, shall not the Most High avenge his own elect, which cry day and night unto him. Hey, we believe we're of that number. We got to believe the Lord's going to avenge us, and not be in the spirit of, I'm gonna do something on my own. I'm gonna get him back. I'm gonna do this. No, the Lord's gonna do it. I'm gonna leave it in His hands. You know. Um, where am I at? This is most importantly. Hold up. Especially that's especially significant because David was destined to become king. Abigail prevented the future king. Oh, so he wasn't a king yet. Salakia. Um, because I said earlier, he was a king, but at this point, David was still pretty famous. People. He killed tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of men. He was basically the top guy underneath Saul. So it's like people. Nabal probably knew about David. He was just saying that. That's the point I'm making. Salakia though he wasn't king yet at that time. But it says prevented the future king from having unnecessary blood guilt in his hand. Now I wanted to tie that in, to the title, bringing it all back. There will be many Abigails because when you look at it, a lot of these women, they're really married to Esau. The majority of our women, they're married uh to the Edomites in the sense of this wicked society. Esau gave these women, so-called women's liberation. They gave these women, you know, so-called, freedom, so-called what you call it, independence, which that's all witchcraft, that's all a lie, and that's all a facade. Because really, these women are still slaves. They're just not slaves under their men as they should be. And why do I say that? The word woman, when you look up the etymology, it means female servant, you know? And I was just watching that brother Shabai, shalom to you, bro, if you're watching. But he just brought that out in his lesson, which was that's the spirit. But the word woman, when you go into the etymology, it means female servant. A woman is supposed to be a servant to her husband. It tells you that in the book of Genesis. When the powers, the angels, they said it's not good for man that man should be alone. He needs a help. A woman is supposed to be a servant to her husband. But all these women, they traded in being a wife. They traded in being a servant to their husband to being a servant to Esau and his system. And we know Esau is a fool. Let me get this scripture. Esau spiritually, Nabal represents Esau as well. Because I'm tying in Nabal. I'm saying Nabal would be a YN. He would be. basically just a Jake in the world. But really, he represents Esau as well. I'm gonna get this scripture to show that. You know, I'm I hope Loveland is making sense. Loveland, you're following the point that I'm trying to bring out. But I'm gonna get Ecclesiastes 4:13. It says better is a poor and wise child than an old and foolish king who will no more be admonished. And who's that old and foolish king that's talking about Esau? And it's spiritual because Esau is the older brother. It said, going back to the prophecy in Genesis, it said, the elder shall serve the younger. Jacob, which Lord willing, well, Salakia, we are Jacob, but I was gonna say Lord willing, we're of the elect. Lord willing, we're of the elect of Jacob, but we go back to Jacob. Um, Jacob came out second, Esau came out first. You know, so Esau is that old king because who's ruling our earth right now? The Edomites. You know, but I'll read that again. Better is a poor and wise child. Who is that poor and wise child? Us. Lord willing, we're of the elect. That's speaking about us. The elect is likened unto a wise virgin, but also a wise child. Yahweh Shai said, except you be like one of these little children, you cannot enter into the kingdom. All right. But Esau Esau is likened unto Nabal. All right. That's the point I wanted to get. Okay, that's a different word, but it means the same thing though. All right, it's ka kata hold up. I believe it's kasayal, if I'm not mistaken. Kasal on that. But I believe it's kasayal. This is full, stupid, dullard, simpleton, arrogant one. And all those adjectives, you could apply it to Esau Edom. Because this man is very, foolish. He's very arrogant. He believes he could do what the Most High can do. That's if that ain't arrogant, I don't know what is. He believes, all the ways of the Lord. You know, it's pointless to follow the Bible. That's an Edomite mindset. All right, I don't have to follow it. I don't have to follow what that book says. I'll do it my own way, and that's who's ruling right now, and that's who these women, are basically following after. All these women, they're married to Nabal. You know, they could talk to however many men they want. That they could get, that they got a false sense of security in the society. Okay. They feel like, that they could just walk all over men. You know, why? Because this foolish king gave them so-called liberty to do so. All right. But pretty soon, just like in the situation on the ball, the Lord is gonna take this wicked king down. All right. But I'm gonna go ahead and Loveland that makes sense, too, because even the scripture speaks about, Israel being joined to many lovers, which is going into those different philosophies as well. But what is the main philosophy on the planet Earth right now? The philosophy of the so-called white man. Like I said, feminism, do as thou wilt. You know, you don't need a husband. You you could get a career. You could do this. You could do that. You know, you could do bad by yourself. However that dumbass saying goes. Excuse my language, but I'm gonna go ahead and get Isaiah 4, and I know we bring this scripture out to death, but hey, we're in these times right now. We're entering into the time of Isaiah 4, the fourth chapter, and it says a remnant prepared. All right, so start at the top. It says, "In that day, 7 women shall take hold of one man, saying, We will eat our own bread and wear our own apparel. Only let us be called by thy name to take away our reproach." And I'm gonna read that in the Bible comparison. In the NOT, it says, "In that day, so few men will be left that 7 women will fight for each man, saying, Let us marry you. We will provide our own food and clothing. Only let us take your name so we won't be mocked as old maids." So pretty soon, of course, I mentioned, Esau and his system is going to be taken down. So these women, their husband Esau is going to be put to death essentially because this system is going down. It's already circling the drain, but when all hell breaks loose, which they're going to try to establish, that beast system with that chip, with the RFID microchip, which is the mark of the beast. But at the same time, it's if it's falling now, it's still going to be falling. It's not like when they bring that chip out, that their kingdom is going to start going back up. It's still going to be in a state of falling. So that's the Lord, taking out in the ball, taking out that fool, which is Esau Edom. But then when you bring it to a carnal level, you know, a lot of women that the Lord is going to give to men of the Lord, they probably got a wicked ass boyfriend, a wicked ass husband. The Lord's going to get rid of all of them. And I'm gonna read that in my next scripture. Second Ezra chapter 16 and verse 33. It says, "The virgin shall mourn, having no bridegrooms. The woman shall mourn, having no husbands. Their daughters shall mourn, having no helpers." Because we're coming into the worst time in human history, the time of Jacob's trouble. Excuse me. The hour of temptation. You know, when the society, completely collapses. When SHTF, when ish hits the fan, which is already hitting the fan. Look at all these food recalls. Look at that blackout going on in Gary, Indiana, which is still going on. This is day 10 of that. Which I was gonna mention that in this lesson, but for time's sake, I'll go into that in a separate lesson, Lord willing. But we're living in these times right now. These women they're about to feel that heat. They're about to feel that pressure on a high level. I'm gonna quote my brother Shabai again. The lesson I was just watching. You women's worst nightmare is about to happen. Roughly paraphrasing, but that was basically the title of his lesson. You know, but verse 34 says, "In the war shall their bridegrooms be destroyed, and their husbands shall perish of famine." So we're currently in a World War III, but it's going to intensify to the point to where they're going to initiate a draft. And like I mentioned, a lot of these women, their men is going to be drafted, or they're going to die in a civil war in the streets of America. They're going to die, you know, be pelted and riddled with bullets. Get hit with a damn hunter killer off of Black Ops 2. But in real life, those drones get hit with a damn explosive drone. Basically, the Lord's gonna be taking these dudes out in all type of various ways. A lot of these wicked niggas you encounter in their day-to-day life. You know, now a lot of the women is gonna be destroyed, but hey, guess what? There's more women than men, so the majority of the elect is gonna be women, and it only makes sense. With 144,000, that those are all men. So the Lord's gonna have enough women for all those members of the 144,000. So it makes sense. He's gonna take out the trash basically in the ball, and he's gonna send you know Lord willing, the true men of the Lord, us brothers, He's gonna send us women. It's gonna come out of nowhere, and like the apostle said, I'm gonna quote Apostle Gabar, you won't believe it's happening even as it's happening. And I could say from speaking with different brothers, it's already happening basically, but it's gonna intensify. All right, you might have, you might have three women, you might have four women. When it's all said and done, you might have 20 women. I don't know. I'm just throwing numbers out there. But Isaiah 4, when it says seven women, that's just a complete number. All right. It says that was pretty much it on that. I could keep reading on that, but Loneliness lesson was edifying and comforting. This was just something I was meditating on. There's gonna be many Abigails. But yeah, that's basically it. I might do a part two, and like I mentioned, Logan, I'm gonna do a lesson going into that situation, in Indiana, as well as those food recalls, But that's it for now. Loneliness was edifying once again, giving all praise to Yahweh, Bashim Yahushai, Bashim Chadash Shalom.